Hi guys, it's Dr. Robinson with a economic update. Today is February 8th, 2023. So guys, on the screen, what you're going to see is the US debt clock. Now this is kind of a quick and dirty method of looking at the size and scope of the US economy. A lot of different things. By the way, this is only a small fraction. If you want to go see the actual debt clock and all of its iterations, you can go to usdebtclock.org. But I'm only going to concern ourselves here with the basically kind of what I think of as the most important things economically going on with the U.S. debt and the U.S. government itself. The first thing that stands out is on the left-hand side. You'll notice the national debt, $31.542 trillion. I'm just going to call it $31.5 trillion. So $31.5 trillion of money we owe. Now that's money that you and I owe, and you'll notice that right next to it, it's if you go on a per person basis or per taxpayer, each of us owes $246,867, and that's as of the time that I did this view of the clock. It's increased by now. So you and I all collectively owe about 246,000. By the way, it doesn't matter who you are. I don't care if you're a 2 year old or somebody who's just born today. That person, as long as they were born today and they're alive by the time you hear this video, that person owes 246,000 too. So at the end of the day, this is how much money we owe collectively to others. By the way, this is not the real number. This is not the real debt. This is what's called on budget debt. I've told you guys before, and you've heard me say this before, the government has effectively two sets of books. They have their on budget debt, which is what they're willing to share with the taxpayers, and then they have their off budget debt. Now, those are just simply liabilities that the United States government owes, but they have not disclosed to the taxpayer through various methods. In other words, there's things like Social Security Trust Fund. The trust fund does not exist. So if the Social Security, if you add up what is owed in Social Security versus what's available, there's a huge deficit between how much money the government has collected versus what they owe in the future. For Social Security, it's right around 25 trillion, by the way. There's a lot more money in Medicare that they owe than they have the money to pay right now. That's about 35 trillion. Right now, there's about 17 trillion in government pensions that they owe, but they don't have the money to pay. They're not on the budget, by the way. So when you add up all of those things, plus a lot of other things that are owed in terms of unfunded liabilities, the national debt is actually somewhere north of $120 trillion. Some people say it's closer to 150. I'm not sure that it's quite that high, but even so, it's just a lot of money that we owe. But what the government has admitted to owing right now in terms of direct obligations right now, $31.5 trillion. Now, down below that, you'll notice spending. U.S. federal spending this year, $6 trillion. It's actually a little above that by $11 billion or so, but what's $11 billion amongst friends? So the government's going to spend about $6 trillion this year. Look over to the right. Out of the $6 trillion that the government's going to spend, where are they going to get that money? Well, the only real source of income to the government is taxes. So the federal government is going to bring in a total of $4.609 trillion in tax revenue. Now, if you look further to the right, you'll see the sources of that tax revenue. Because basically, the government has four places from which they can obtain money. Income tax is by far the most. So $2.6 trillion in tax money from the IRS. There's the payroll tax. That includes your FICA tax, et cetera. So we got another $1.5 trillion of revenue coming in from the payroll tax. Corporations are going to pay taxes, but you'll notice corporations don't pay a whole lot of taxes in terms of compared to how much you and I pay. Corporations will pay about $436 billion in taxes. When politicians start talking about we're going to make corporations pay a lot more taxes, it doesn't work that way. There's not enough corporations, and corporations are already paying 20%. The tax rate on corporations is 21%. It's not generating as much money as a lot of people think. They think that companies like General Motors or Apple or whatever are so big that they're producing or providing trillions of dollars of revenue to the government. They're not. At the end of the day, corporations will pay about $436 billion in revenue to the government today or this year. And then lastly, tariffs. Now, tariffs are import fees and things where we charge other countries for bringing their stuff into our country. We'll raise about $73 billion this year in tariff taxes. When you add up all those four sources of income, it comes out to about $4.6 trillion in revenue. But that poses a problem. If we're bringing in $4.6 trillion of revenue and we're spending 6.011, a little over $6 trillion in revenue, or expenses rather, we've got a deficit. So you'll notice back over on the left next to the federal spending, you see the budget deficit. This is the official number. So as of right now, the federal deficit, $1.402 trillion. It's some change. So 1.402. In other words, we've spent $1.4 trillion more than we've brought in. Now that in and of itself is a problem. And by the way, if this was a person, if this was an individual, or even a company, a corporation, they would be forced into bankruptcy. To put this in perspective, let's say you had $600,000 of income. I'm sorry, $460,000 of income. I'm just going to keep it in simple terms. If your income is $460,000 and you're spending $600,000, unless you've got a lot of savings somewhere, you're bankrupt. And therefore, you're going to go into bankruptcy court. You just don't have the money to pay your bills. And your credit card companies, you might be funding something through a credit card or maybe take out a home equity loan or something. But eventually, your creditor is going to say, you know what? You're so far in the hole, you have no hope of ever paying this off. We're cutting you off. Now you're going to bankruptcy. That's the federal government. So government is technically bankrupt right now in terms of where they get their money, what the sources of money is. Now, I'm not saying they're bankrupt because legally the government of the United States cannot go into bankruptcy. But what the government's going to have to do is they're going to have to start raising taxes significantly to start covering this shortage. The problem doesn't stop there. But before I go any further on that, I want to draw your attention to one other thing down at the bottom, gross domestic product. So you'll notice that, and I've got an arrow pointing to it, it says U.S. gross domestic product, $26.203 trillion. So just a tad over $26 trillion in GDP. Now keep in mind, and I've told you this before, and you guys know this if you've listened to me talk at all, there's really two ways to measure GDP. And I'll be the first to admit, by the way, that I don't think GDP is the best way to measure the U.S. economy. There's other ways, total sales in the country, but there's other ways to look at how the economy is doing and stuff. But for a quick and dirty method, GDP is pretty good. So when we look at GDP, the first thing I want to point out is this is what we call nominal GDP. Now the word nominal just simply comes from the Latin word meaning named. It's the named GDP. We call it that because it consists of things that are real and not real. So don't confuse nominal GDP with real GDP, which is over on the right-hand side over there. So if you'll look at the nominal GDP is $26 trillion. But what this $26 trillion includes is about $20 trillion of real wealth. That's the assets we all own, houses and land and all the stuff in our economy, or the goods and services in our economy in a year. $20 trillion a year. But that means where'd the other $6 trillion come from? It came out of thin blue air. It's a creation of monetary policy by the government. So when we talk about the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply, how does the government increase the money supply? Well, historically, the only way to increase the money supply was to increase your supply of gold. Well, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard a long time ago. I think it was 1972. When we went off the gold standard, and the reason we went off the gold standard, by the way, is to make it easier for the government to print money without having to mine gold for it or to buy gold. So since we're no longer on the gold standard, you can print as much money as you want. So effectively what's happened here is the government of the United States has printed about $6 trillion of additional money that did not come from wealth creation. And by the way, this is where a lot of people get confused. They think since they assume that money is value or is wealth, it's not, by the way. Money is just a medium of exchange. A dollar bill in and of itself has no value. To create wealth from something, you have to take that dollar and invest it or produce some sort of work or some sort of goods and services to grow the economy, and you can make that dollar more valuable. But in and of itself, the $6 trillion doesn't add any real wealth to the economy. But even so, let's look at the nominal GDP number. And this is the one that the news media like to talk about the best because it makes the government look a little bit more efficient. It's not a terribly good number, by the way, but it does make them look a little bit more efficient. One of the things that we do to measure a country's debt or its ability to survive long term is we measure their income versus how much they owe, just like on a balance sheet with you and I or with a corporation. Well, if you look at our debt to income ratio or debt to GDP, we're at 120%. So we owe $31.5 trillion versus income, if you will, of $26.2 trillion. We're in the hole. So we're basically 20% upside down, a little more than 20% upside down in our income. Now, just like in your life and in my life, there are times where we end up going into debt for short periods of time. And for short periods of time, it's okay. Sometimes it's never really okay, but sometimes we just go through it, especially when we're young and we're just starting out. We buy houses and maybe we bought a house that's a little bit too expensive for our income. And every month we're struggling to make mortgage payments and car payments and, maybe trying to save money to put the kids through college and stuff. And maybe you get out of college and you're making $3,000 or $4,000 a month, and your expenses might be for a period of time $5,000 a month. So maybe you have to dip in your savings for a while. That's normal. Most people go through that at various times in their lives, but it's not sustainable. At some point, you can't keep living off your savings because you're going to use all your savings up. That's what the government's in danger of doing. They've already run through their savings, and now they're basically spending 20% more than what they've got coming in. That takes us over there to the real GDP. So real GDP is a measurement of the actual economy, excluding all of that, I'm going to call it counterfeit money. I know a lot of economists get mad when you use the word counterfeit, but in essence, that's what it is. So we've got about $6 trillion of counterfeit money in the U.S. economy from the Federal Reserve through their monetary policy. Real GDP is currently about $20.2 trillion. I get that number, by the way, from the Federal Reserve. I'm not making these numbers up. All these numbers, by the way, come from the federal government. So nobody can come along and say, well, Richard's using his own numbers or he made up the numbers or whatever. These come from the government. So if you go to the Federal Reserve, the one I like to use because they make their product easy to get to, is the Federal Reserve out of St. Louis. So when you look at the Federal Reserve, the GDP number from the Federal Reserve out of St. Louis, fourth quarter GDP, $20.2 trillion. $6 trillion of fake money in the economy. So our real GDP to debt ratio is not 120%. We're not spending 20% more money than we've got coming in. We're spending 56% more money coming in than we've got coming in. So our real debt to GDP ratio is 156.15%, which is unsustainable at massive levels. In fact, it wasn't very long ago where Greece got into some financial troubles in the euro or the European conglomerate, and they were threatened with being thrown out of the European Union if they didn't bring their debt to GDP ratio down, and they were roughly at 150%. A country cannot sustain itself financially when your debt to GDP ratio is that high. Unsustainable. But in and of itself, this is nothing new. So what I wanted to do is kind of share with you some other slides to look at some other things, because these numbers are actually going to start getting significantly worse from here. So let me show you another couple of slides. So just to reiterate, here's what's important on the debt clock that I just showed you. So the on-budget debt is currently $31.5 trillion. Federal spending is currently $6.18 trillion. Federal revenues are $4.6 trillion. The federal deficit is just under $1.5 trillion. Remember that number was 1.4 something. So I'm going to round it to 1.5 trillion dollars. But look what's coming. Over the last couple of years, by the way, this slide shows you what we call transfer payments. Now, transfer payments are government payments to people and companies or businesses for whatever it is they do or for whatever purpose the government wants. They also include Social Security. Social Security is actually the biggest of the transfer payments. Now, a lot of people assume that the Social Security payment that they're getting is money that was set aside for them. That's not true. That's not how Social Security was set up. It's one of the biggest fallacies about Social Security. But we're not going to get into how Social Security works and stuff because that's not the point here. What I want you to understand is that transfer payments are all of the money that the government takes in from taxpayers and gives to other people. It includes Social Security, of course. It includes welfare payments, the SNAP program, which is the old food stamps program. So SNAP, any kind of housing subsidies you might get from the government, cell phones, health care, all the things that the government provides. Remember, you're not producing any goods or services in the economy. This is just money. I like to call it welfare. It always offends people when you call it welfare, though, because nobody likes to be on welfare, but everybody loves getting those government checks. When somebody gets a government check, that's a transfer payment. So right now, the transfer payments are at $2.8 trillion, $2.88 trillion, actually. Now, that's actually a reduction from where we were. But remember, when COVID first hit, the government was sending out checks like crazy to all kinds of people, and they were sending them out to businesses. And sometimes they were sending them to businesses that had no business getting those checks. For example, Coca-Cola got some of that money. Now, why Coca-Cola got subsidies for COVID, beyond me. But hey, that's politics today. So we're coming down from $5 trillion in transfer payments. We're back down to the norm. And by the way, this 2.88 kind of gets us back to where that sloping line is. You'll notice these transfer payments have been increasing for a long time. If you go back to 1990 rather, the transfer payments were only $481 billion. And then by 2001, they were 778. So they had doubled in about a decade. By 2008, they're at 1.26 or 286 trillion dollars, and then by 2019, 2.319 trillion dollars, and then because of COVID, they jumped to 4.699, and then to $5 trillion dollars, and now they're back down to 2.88, which kind of picks up at 2.319 area on the chart. Now that chart is still going to be an upward sloping chart. So it's going to continue to get worse from here. So this number is probably next year going to say be 3.1, maybe 3.2 trillion, 3.4 trillion. It was within the realm of possibility. Again, it kind of depends on the economy and what's going on. But right now, the expectation, right now it's 2.88 trillion. The expectation is going to be significantly higher, let's say 5 years from now. Probably 5 years from now, if you take this chart and extrapolate forward, which is what we do, you're going to easily be into the $3.5 to $4 trillion range in the next 5 years or so. So those are the transfer payments. So what does that matter, do you think? Well, remember, the government of the United States brings in the $4 trillion of revenue. 2.8 trillion of that money is going just for the transfer payments, nothing else. And we're not talking about covering the cost of defense. We're not talking about paying the Marine Corps, the Navy, anything. We're not talking about that. We're just simply talking about all the people who are collecting a government check. All right, not even including government employees, by the way. So this is money that is going to other people for rent, for housing, for food, for welfare payments, for Medicare, Medi-Cal, or not Medi-Cal, that's out of California, but Medicare and Medicaid. All of those programs that the government funds are coming out of the transfer payments. So just shy of $3 trillion. It's worse. As you guys know, interest rates have been going up for about a year now. A year ago, interest rates were at about 0.99. That's where they kind of started. They were actually a little bit lower. I think they started at about 0.82. So 82 basis points was the interest rate about a little over a year ago. I think it was February of last year, or I'm sorry, late January of last year. But anyway, interest rates are significantly higher now. We're in the 3.5 to 4 range, depending on what kind of bond we're looking at. Interest rates are significant. Now remember, interest rate increases not only hurt you and I when things cost more. If you buy a house with an interest rate at 2%, your monthly payment's going to be pretty low versus buying a house with an interest rate at 5%. Monthly payment's going to be significantly higher. Well, the government does the same thing. They feel the same bite. When the government issues debt, they have to issue debt based on current interest rates. So current interest rates are a lot higher than what they've been. Right now, the interest on the national debt, $853 billion, which is significant. It's nearly $1 trillion. It is the second biggest expense in the government today. And by the way, remember what I said earlier. Transfer payments, the $2.88 billion we talked about, or $1 trillion rather, we just talked about, those create no wealth or income, no goods or services in the economy. Neither does this. This is like you paying off your MasterCard or having a MasterCard bill and maybe the interest rate's at 24%. I think that's pretty much the highest they can go. So if your interest rate's at 24%, and let's say you make a monthly payment of 100, I'm just going to make some numbers up. You make a payment of $100. Out of that $100, most of it's going to the interest, and very little is going to the principal. It'll take you decades to pay off that credit card. I don't care what the balance is either. With an interest rate that high, you're never going to pay off the balance. Well, the government doesn't pay off balances anyway. They just roll debt over. A lot of the debt that we have in this country actually is dated to World War II. We've never paid any of that stuff off because we keep electing stupid people to Congress and stuff. So when you look at it, the interest on our national debt, $853 billion, the second largest expense in the budget, produces no goods or services. So there's no value here. This is money that is down the drain. So really, we've got, basically little over $3 trillion of dead weight in the economy. And we haven't paid for anything yet, really, other than the transfer payments and the national debt. Let me go. In a nutshell, we bring in $4.6 trillion. We have transfer payments of $2.8 trillion, interest on the national debt, $853 billion. Defense spending, we got to pay the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, Space Force now, Coast Guard. They've all got to be paid. That's going to run the United States this year, $817 billion. It's the third biggest expense in the economy or in the country. U.S. government salaries. Now, this excludes all military people, but all the other government employees. By the way, the government is the largest employer in the country. Over 2 million people work for the United States government. The government is bloated. They've got so many people in their employment that basically do nothing, and they all get really high salaries. And by the way, these numbers are based on the average salary of $78,000, and a lot of government employees make much more than that. So, in fact, Jerome Powell yesterday was talking. Somebody asked him about how much does the Federal Reserve Chairman get. He's being paid about $200,000 a year. Some employees get really high salaries. Others are kind of middle of the road. But on average, the average salary for a government employee in the United States today is $78,500, much higher than it is the national salary of non-government employees. It used to be years ago that government always had better benefits for employees because their salaries were always lower. Today it's upside down. They get the best benefits and they get pay that is on average greater than what you would get in the private sector. So government salaries this year, $165 billion. And I've cut off all spending. By the way, if you just stop the spending here, and what I mean by that, let's not count any money that the government's going to spend on roads and bridges and shooting down balloons from China and all the other stuff that they're going to do that costs money. Just these four programs are going to cost $9.3 trillion in expenses against $4.6 trillion of income. If you're bringing in 4.6, that's basically double. Now your debt to income ratio is about 200%. The country's in a mess. This can't last. And the downside here, of course, is that this is only going to get exponentially worse as time goes on. So when the government starts talking about the economy's in good shape, or we're doing this, or we got to increase taxes and stuff, what they've got to do is they've got to cut spending, but they're never going to cut spending because nobody's going to vote for a politician that cuts spending. We always want to vote for some guy that's going to give us another check, one of those transfer payments. We all love transfer payments. At the end of the day, we're running out of money. So the deficit, instead of being $1.5 trillion, is going to jump to or bloat to $4.7 trillion. And next year, it gets even worse. And then, of course, the year after that, the year after that. And Social Security is it's getting to the point where there's just not enough money to come in to cover that as well. Where are you going to get this? And by the way, this excludes all other government spending. Like I said, it doesn't include anything spending on roads or bridges and tunnels and dams and all the things that the government likes to do. They like to do a lot of environmental stuff today. Where's the money coming from? Well, you can only print it for so long. So at the end of the day, we're in deep trouble. And I don't care what any politician may tell you that I'm wrong about this, but most of them went to law school, or what I jokingly call clown college, they have no business being in a position where they're talking about what the health of the economy is. That's actually one of my pet peeves with Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell is not an economist. He's head of the Federal Reserve, but he's not an economist. He's a lawyer. At the end of the day, do we really want a lawyer? There used to be an old adage in college when we taught business classes. There's two people in the world you never wanted to have running anything because they're not trained for it, and that's lawyers and accountants. Whenever you have a lawyer or an accountant running something, a lawyer, and it's not because they're stupid or anything. I'm not saying that at all. But their job, or their training, is for something else. Their training is to look for problems. Their training is to get into the minutia of things. When you get in the minutia, you get lost in the big picture. Business owners, the great thing about business owners is business owners can generally see the big picture. You guys, most of you guys are self-employed. So when you look at your business, you look at the big picture. How much money do I have coming in versus how much do I have going out? If you've got more going out than coming in, you have to make changes. There's things you have to do. Whereas a lawyer doesn't look at it that way. A lawyer just simply says, this is what's happening, and maybe turn to somebody else to kind of solve how to solve that problem. But they just identify the problem. Lawyers and accountants identify the problems. Business owners have to try to figure it out, or economists, or whatever it may be. But at the end of the day, we're spending our deficit this year is going to be about $4.7 trillion in total, in real terms, by the way, which takes our debt to GDP ratio of close to 200%. Things are getting worse and worse as time goes on. I just wanted to point that out for you guys. The point here is, as this gets worse, and it's going to get worse, especially the younger you are. I'm in my 60s now, early 60s. I don't know how much time I have left, but at the end of the day, I don't want to see the country go into bankruptcy, or have to go through what people may have to go through, which would be infinitely or significantly worse than what anybody saw in the 1930s with the Great Depression. I'd hate to see anyone have to go through that. You've got to save as much money as you can, and when things really start getting bad, you have to try to figure something out to solve problems. But at the end of the day, when people talk about inflation is going to go away, it's not going to go away. When you're creating all this money out of thin air, that's just adding to inflation. Inflation is, over the next year or so, it may come down a little bit, but if you look at it from a long-term point of view, inflation can only get worse from here, because inflation is just, the word inflation comes from the concept of the Federal Reserve inflating the money supply. So whenever you increase the money supply infinitely like this, you're creating all kinds of worthless money that drives up prices for things. But that's it in a nutshell. I just wanted to point this out to you guys. You got to pay attention. You've got to kind of keep to your guns in terms of save as much money as you can, try to control your expenses as much as you can going forward. And I'm not talking about this year or next year, of course. We're just talking over the next, let's say decade or so. Things are going to get really out of control in this country financially. And it's an exponential problem that grows every day. Other than that, if you have any questions on anything I've talked about, give me a call, text, email, whatever it is, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.